Okay, great. Let's start. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on this training session. I'm Amelia. I'm the Community Manager Coordinator for the Early Years strand of the Beyond programme. For those of you that are just joining us Beyond for the first time, it's a programme of free and funded digital and design support for nonprofits, and we're focusing on supporting organisations working with pregnant families during pregnancy up to early years, and organisations supporting financial wellbeing in those at risk of financial insecurity. This session is the second in our 6-part training programme, and it's about understanding the changing needs of people and systems in times of uncertainty. I want to say a huge thank you to Fan, who can probably give us a bit of a wave now, who is joining us as the trainer today. Fan previously worked at Shift, which is the organisation behind Beyond, and we think she's absolutely amazing. She's an independent researcher who's worked at the Innovation Unit and Food for Life, and she's freelance and helps out at really impactful organisations, things like FutureGov and Design Council, among others. So today she's going to be talking to us about understanding the changing needs of people who use your services. I'm really excited about the session. We're going to run for about an hour. I'm going to be here available on the chat, so if you have any questions or you need any support with technical issues, just message me directly in the chat and I'll help you out. This is a webinar, so you won't see yourselves or each other, and we're going to record it, but you won't be visible. So your kind of anything that you see or say won't be recorded. It will just be Fan and the slides and me. But if you do want to kind of join in with the chat or respond to what Fan's saying, it's really nice for us to see that you're engaging. So please post in the chat, and remember to post to all panelists and attendees in the drop down box so that everyone can see what's happening and join the conversation. We'll be doing a Q&A at the end, so save all of your questions. I think that's everything, Fan. I'll hand over to you to get started.
Great, thanks, Amelia. Hi, everybody. It's quite odd not to see anyone, but anyway, I will assume that everyone is smiling and engaged and happy. So my name is Fan Sissoko, as Amelia said. I've been working as a designer and researcher in London for the last 10 years or so, working mostly with the charity and public sector. And today is going to be about the importance of research and how do you kind of keep in touch with what your beneficiaries need, and then how can you use those insights to shape your services according to people's needs. So let's start. There's kind of 3 sections to this talk. So the first one, I'm going to try to convince you really hard that research is really important. And then the second section is going to be, I'm going to give you an overview of different research methods. And then finally, I'm going to be quite practical and tell you kind of step by step what I would be doing when I'm planning a research project. So let's start with why design research. So this is an image that I like to show when I try and talk about design research. And this is called the desire path. And that's when someone, generally urban designers, kind of design a really lovely green urban space. And then people decide that actually they're not really happy with the layout of it and they want to use it differently because they have somewhere to go and they can't be bothered with, kind of going all the way around to get to where they need to go. And so they kind of end up walking through the area that's not meant for walking. And the reason why I like to show this image is that it's a very good example of when designers or people who are kind of planning a space or a service are not doing their research. So that's an example of, the planners behind this space haven't really taken the time to actually sit down, talk to people who use that space, observe how they use the space, think about what they need from the space, think about where they need to go, etc. And what they've ended up with is a space that people don't really enjoy using because their shoes might get muddy when they go through it. So first of all, people who are the intended beneficiaries don't enjoy using it, but also it's kind of, ruining the lovely design that you've put together. So that's kind of a metaphor for why you need to do your research when you're putting anything out into the world, whether it's a new service or a new product. You kind of need to understand how people are going to use it and what they want from it so that you can make sure that it's actually, tailored to their needs. So if you've joined the last session, Teo talked about design thinking and gave you a definition of what it is. And this is just a reminder of it. Essentially, it's a way of solving a problem. And you do that through finding creative ways of looking at the problem and re-understanding the problem. And then you look at creative ways of solving that problem. So generally, you kind of start with going wide. So if your problem is, I'm just going to take the example of the last person who joined the talk, that moms are struggling with fitting in some physical activity into their day, then you kind of want to understand why, and you want to spend a little bit of time looking at why is that happening, what are the factors that are getting in their way, and then how is that affecting them, and what would be their motivation to kind of get around that problem. So you want to understand how they themselves experience that challenge. And then when you move towards the solution space, then again you want to first of all play with a few different solutions, right? You don't want to go into defining one solution and then thinking that that's the right one. You probably want to test a few different solutions and see which one sticks, and which ones your beneficiaries actually want to be part of. And at the core of that design thinking process, at the center of that process people should be at the center of that process. So when we talk about research, we can mean different things. When I talk about research in the context of this talk, what I mean is human-centered research. So I'm talking about the kind of research that will help you to pay attention to what people need, what they aspire to, what their motivations are, what their behaviors are, and why they behave the way they do. So yeah, that is the kind of research that I'm going to refer to through this talk. And right now, research is really, it's always important, but it's particularly important right now because, well, first of all, we're in the middle of a pandemic and people's realities are changing kind of almost on a weekly basis. So on a weekly basis, we are introduced to new directions from government, new rules, new impacts of the crisis, and we are constantly having to adjust to change. So the families and the individuals you're working with are seeing their lives kind of radically transform, and they're having to constantly adapt to that. And so as an organization, you're also having to adapt to those emerging needs. Because, for example, what might have been at the kind of forefront of a family's priorities last year might have completely changed now because of the pandemic. It's also, research is also really important right now because access to services and support network is just reduced. So people can't just turn up to an appointment, as you know, or to a class or to a group session. And so you, as organizations, you're having to rethink how you deliver services to people. Some of you have had to go completely remotely. And so you need to think about how that new design of the way you deliver your services, how does that fit into people's lives? Do they have access to digital devices that enable them to join in your session, or do you need to find other ways to deliver your services? And these are things that organizations maybe have had to think about in the past, but in the last few months, you're having to think about that in a really kind of accelerated manner. So again, that's where doing research is really important. And then finally, especially this summer, we saw that the pandemic has really highlighted some inequalities that already existed. And at the back of the Black Lives Matter protests, a lot of organizations became even more aware of the fact that they had to do something differently in order to be inclusive. And so you need to be really intentional about who you include, and remember that everyone that is not included is excluded, even if it's not intentional. So yeah, so for those 3 reasons, I think that research is really important. It will help you to understand how people's needs are changing, how you can organize your services to make them accessible, and also to understand who are you not reaching and why are you not reaching them. So let's take a couple of minutes to pause and ask yourself some questions. So I've got 4 questions here. How has life changed for your beneficiaries? You know, what are the ways that you've already seen their lives and their needs changing? How are you as an organization adapting your services to their new reality? Who are you not reaching? Who is not included? You know, who might benefit from what you have to offer, but who maybe doesn't see themselves in what you have to offer. And then the last question is a really important one. So are you ready to hear that your intuitions may be wrong? So it's really, you know, everyone, even the most experienced researchers will go into research with, you know, a big question, a big challenge, and they will have assumptions about how people are experiencing this challenge, why, you know, the reasons why this challenge may be a challenge for this group of people, and also about assumptions about the solution, what the solution may be. So you might kind of start research and think, oh, you know, I'm pretty sure that we need to go in that direction. It's very important when you start research to be ready to be challenged and to be open to hearing that what you're thinking may be wrong, because otherwise there's no point doing research if you already know the answer. So yeah, again, like, be aware of the assumptions that you're bringing into research and be ready to hear that what you had in mind is maybe not the priority that people have in their own mind. Okay, the next section, I'm going to give you a few research methods. This is going to be the heftier section, so bear with me. I'm also aware that it's 12, so some of you might be eating, might be really hungry, or might be digesting. So I'm going to try and be aware of your energy levels as I go through this. So I've mapped a few research methods which I think could be useful to some of you. And the way I've mapped those is against that design thinking process that I mentioned earlier. So if you look from left to right, on the left, you've got the research methods that I will tend to prefer at the beginning of a process when maybe you don't know that much about the challenge that you're trying to solve, or you don't know that much about the people that you are trying to work with. So you're really trying to get some new insight and some in-depth knowledge about that challenge. And then towards the right hand of the diagram, it tends to be research methods that are useful once you have a good idea of what it is that you're actually delivering. So maybe you want some new ideas for how to deliver it, or you want to get some validation about your idea, and you want people to say, yes, actually this is what we want, or yes, this is what we want, but it would be better if you did it like this. And then so that's the horizontal spectrum. And then the other axis, the vertical axis, gives you a sense of the research methods that enable you to go more in depth, and to really kind of get behind the needs that are on the surface, and to really understand what's going on for people, what are their kind of deeper motivations. And then at the top, you've got research methods that maybe enable you to reach a larger number of people, but where you tend to stay on the surface. So these types of these research methods might be useful when you're looking for trends, for example, when you're looking for like almost statistics of within this group of people, roughly half of them like to do this, or roughly half of them struggle with that problem. So I'm going to go in depth into those methods now. Okay, so the first one is ethnography, and I know a lot of people struggle to say the word ethnography or struggle to remember it, so you can remember it if you want to as a day in the life of. Ethnography as a research method, it comes from anthropology, and it would generally be about looking at a different culture or a subculture and kind of observing that culture in a way to learn about how this group of people experiences the world. But in the context of design thinking, or kind of third sector innovation, what we're referring to when we say ethnography is more like kind of in-depth research, where you might be spending a day in the life of someone. So you typically, what that would look like is that you go and meet someone, maybe in their home or maybe in a place where they feel comfortable to be with you, and they kind of guide you through their life. So you might come with a set of questions, but essentially it's kind of down to them to tell you what's important to them and what they want you to really understand about the challenge that they're struggling with. So it's spending time with people in their own context, and obviously it requires kind of a detailed research guide, so you have to be prepared for it. And then some careful ethical considerations, which I'll get to at the end of this talk. And I'll give you an example of a past project. So a few years ago, I was doing some research on food insecurity in the rural, and we spent some time, I think, with about 20 people altogether. But one of them was this man, kind of single man, I think in his 50s, who had mental health issues. And I went to spend the day with him, and we went to the supermarket together, and he kind of showed me how he shops, and he kind of had everything down to the cent. He knew exactly what to get, and he was kind of in and out in a minute, because he knew exactly what he could afford, and so he kind of avoided temptation by just going straight for the porridge, straight for this, straight for that, and out of the shop. And that's something, that behavior is not something I could have been aware of if I had just done an interview with him over the phone or even in person. Like, it's not something that he might have thought about telling me, or that I would have thought about asking him. That's something I kind of had to observe, just to understand the length he had to go through to maximize his budget. The other thing that I observed with him was, so later in the day, we went to his home and then had a more in-depth interview. And then at some point there was a silence in the conversation, and kind of started to look towards the window. There was a big window in his living room, and on the windowsill there was a pair of binoculars, and the window looked onto a field and then onto the motorway. And he kind of told me about the binoculars, and he said, sometimes during the day, I like to just sit here, and either I look at birds or I look at what's going on the motorway, because sometimes you've got accidents or you've got, heavy traffic, and that kind of led onto a conversation about loneliness. And he never really used the word loneliness, but it was a conversation about being lonely, and about, his reduced social network, and about that, the motorway being his entertainment. And so the reason why I'm giving you this example is that then we went on to when we started to move towards the solution space, the types of solutions we came up with, we made sure that they weren't just about food insecurity, but they were also about social isolation. And again, that's something that without being there with that person in their context, I probably wouldn't have gotten to that insight. So obviously I'm telling you about, spending a day in the life of somebody. But when in times of COVID, that's probably not possible. But there are ways of doing this remotely. So you can look at doing online journals or like photo or video diaries, for example, where you send your participant a task or a question, maybe every day for a week, or they have to document something within their life, and then send that to you, and then maybe you have a phone call or a video call with them, where you kind of ask them about what they've documented and why, and kind of dig deeper into what it is that how they experience a specific challenge. So that's ethnography. And when you do, so obviously research is all about empathy. So it's all about gaining empathy for a group of people and how they experience a challenge. But sometimes your own empathy has limits. You might work with people and you just have maybe no kind of point of reference within your life for what they are going through. And it's really important to recognize that and not to assume that you will, as a researcher, you'll be able to go in, get what their life is about, and then leave and have the insight. Like, it's really important to question yourself and think, actually, am I the best placed person to connect with that person and to get the depth of insight that I want to get? If the answer is no, then it's good to look at peer research. And that's when you will train people who are members of the community. And by community, I don't just mean ethnic community, I mean community as in the group of people that you're researching. So people who've got experience of the issue that you're researching, and then getting them to do the research or to do the interviews or to work with you during the interviews. And when I've done that, I found that, first of all, the interviews tend to be richer because peer researchers kind of know what questions to ask. And then they also know, they have an intuition about how to interpret the data more truthfully. So they might be able to say, oh, that person said this, but really in our kind of culture or subculture, what they mean is this. And it's very important to kind of have that ability to check with somebody if you're interpreting the data right. And it's also a good way to just, making sure that people feel like they can open up in a way that they might not feel like they can open up if they're being researched by someone who has, no idea of their life experience. So again, you can pretty much use the same online methods that you would if you were doing ethnography, but just use peers in the process. A more straightforward, perhaps, research methods is expert interviews. And I think it's really important when you're starting something new, or when you're reconsidering the way you're currently delivering services, to accept that you're not the only expert. You might be the expert because you've got, maybe years and years of experience doing what you're doing. But sometimes it's helpful to actually look at, who else has been trying to solve that problem? What can we learn from them? What can they tell us about the kind of solutions we are thinking about? Sometimes, they can just be kind of directing you and towards the right kind of solutions. And what I found with experts is that generally they tend to like speaking, they tend to like sharing what it is that they've developed expertise on. So they tend to be quite easy to actually get to speak to. And quite quickly you can get to useful insights that will make sure that you're not wasting time exploring a route that actually is not going to work because it's been tried and tested somewhere else before. And it's quite easy to just set up, just a video or a phone call, an hour or 2 hours. Yeah. So the first three methods, ethnography, peer research, and expert interviews, are more useful when you're towards the beginning of your process, so when you're looking at new insights. When you're moving towards ideas, I find maybe public engagement is quite a good method, because it enables you. Public engagement is useful when you might want to reach a community that might not come to a workshop, or maybe you just want like a really broad range of insights. Maybe you were already running a service somewhere and you're trying to implement it in a new area, a new neighborhood, and you don't have much experience of that neighborhood. So you're kind of trying to get in touch with the community there and trying to understand, who is around. So it's kind of like you're casting your net much wider with public engagement. The way, there are like tons of different ways of doing it, but just to give you an example, you could put up a market store somewhere. You could join a community fair, you could do on-street engagement. Like basically you go to where people are, and you kind of, maybe you offer them something in exchange for a short conversation. What you get with public engagement is generally you can reach quite a lot of people, but you won't get as much depth as if you spend obviously a whole day with someone. So you might start seeing a trend or get pieces of information about a neighborhood that you might not otherwise come across, but you won't get much insight in terms of like why are people behaving this way or what's their core motivation. You can do that remotely as well. For example, there are some apps that you can get quite creative, but there are some apps that enable people, anyone with a phone or a computer, to send you a voice message. So you could kind of send out a question, and then you kind of receive stories or opinions through that voice messaging app. You could send open calls for like photographs or videos in answer to a question. Again, I guess the difference with ethnography or peer research is that you would be quite open, and you might not necessarily target it to a specific group of people, or more in a more basic way, you can just send out a survey. Then when you've got a good grasp of the problem that you're trying to solve and you want to move towards ideas, a good way to do that is by involving people who are going to be benefiting from those ideas in actually generating those ideas. So you can hold co-design workshops. Again, there are like tons of different ways of hosting those, and like the only limit to that is your imagination. But essentially what I will try to do when I'm planning a co-design workshop is to make sure that I get a group that is representative of the types of people who not only will be using the solution you're developing, but who will also be part of implementing it. And that's to make sure that you get buy-in from quite early on, from whether it's your staff or whether it's other partners, that they feel like they are part of the solution. What that looks like in practice is a creative session. So this photograph, for example, is taken from a project that I did last year, which was about healthy eating in primary schools. And so we got a group of pupils from different age groups, as well as a couple of teachers. I think we had a PE teacher, we had the school chef, we had a kind of catering team, and we kind of got them together to discuss the challenges that they were seeing in terms of healthy eating, but also to discuss, like we had a kind of miniature map of their canteen, and we kind of got them to like reshape it together, and come up with new ideas for what they could do in the space. So that is, again, possible to do remotely. You set up a video call kind of like this one, but ensure that people can see each other. And then you can use apps like Mural or Miro, that are almost the same name and do almost the same thing, but they are not the same. Where people can actually move. It's like a shared piece of paper, basically. Okay, let's move on. So when you almost have a solution, or you almost have a product and you feel like you're almost ready to launch it, but maybe there are a few details that you're like, I'm not sure whether to, for example, I'm not sure whether people might prefer the blue branding or the purple branding, or I'm not sure whether I should phrase this invitation this way or this way, or I'm not sure if people would want to sign up to this in that way, or whether they would prefer to sign up this way. That's when you kind of get to those like small detailed questions about how the thing will work in practice. That's when you're generally ready to do usability testing, or in a simple way you can just say observation. But that's basically when you're putting your product or your service in the hands of people, an early version of it. It doesn't matter if it's not perfect, and you're getting them to use it. And as they're using it, they're kind of describing to you what they like, what they find annoying, what they find challenging, what's putting them off. And then by doing that, then you're able to like fix those problems as you go. So it's basically put your product early in the hands of people, so that you can find out what's working and what's not working for them, so that you can fix it before you kind of launch it at scale. So it's more when you're looking for validation. Okay, so let's again take a minute for you to ask yourself, at the stage you're at, what are you looking for? So would you be looking for new insights on a challenge that you've maybe never worked on, or that you're encountering in your group of clients because of the current situation? So is it new insights, or is it new ideas? Like maybe there is a challenge that you and your beneficiaries have come across time and time again, but now you're asking yourself, okay, we have to solve it differently, because maybe the old way is not working. So maybe what you're looking for is new ideas, or maybe you're actually already quite far along in having defined what it is that you need to do, and you just need validation that you're heading in the right direction. So these questions are really important before you go into research again, because they will help you to select, which methods are most appropriate for your objective. Okay. In the next section, I'm going to be a lot more practical and kind of give you a step-by-step of how I would run a research project. Obviously, the reality is much more messier than what I'm going to share with you, but I think it's good to at least have some building blocks that you know you're going to have to encounter, or you know you're going to have to go through them. The first question that you'll probably need to ask yourself when you're planning research is who to talk to. Like, who are you going to research with and why? An easy, like a straightforward way of defining those people is by using this kind of 3-circle diagram where you map who is already benefiting from what you're doing. So who are your kind of core user groups? Who else could benefit? So maybe, who are you not yet reaching that could become part of your user group? And then who could help you learn about the issue that you're trying to solve? So who are the experts or maybe potential partners that you could talk to enlighten you or to help you kind of pick a direction? And when you do that, it's important to think about demographics. So for example, I know a lot of you work with parents. So maybe some of you work with single parents, and maybe you've read some data about actually, I'm just making this up, this is not based on truth, but maybe single mothers under 25 tend to be the most affected by this particular challenge. Therefore, you might want to kind of target your research to them. So it's like, try and look at data about your user groups, and then try and use that data in order to kind of focus your research. But also try and think about behaviors and mindset, and not just demographics. So for example, again, if we take that example of, say, young mothers under 25, you might want to speak to young mothers under 25 who are really proactive about accessing the help that they need. Or you might also want to speak to mothers who are not proactive at all and who maybe are quite resistant to change. So you kind of want to look at different ends of a spectrum of behaviors and mindset. And that is because when you start designing or when you start thinking about your solution, you want to make sure that you're able to reach kind of both extremes. And from both extremes, you're also able to learn about, what might work for everyone. And again, that reminder, anyone who's not included in your research is excluded from it. So even if you're not intentionally excluding people, if you haven't spoke to a specific group of people, or if you haven't, considered their needs, then that might manifest in like a barrier for them to access what you're offering to them. Once you've defined who to talk to, then it's time to think about recruitment. And the question that I get asked the most when I do training on design research is like, how many people do I need to speak to? Like, what's a good sample? And the answer is, it depends on what you're trying to find out. So if what you are trying to find out is like trends or kind of almost statistical data about the behaviors or preferences of a group of people, then you want to go for quantity. If what you're trying to find out is more about the why, so why are people behaving a certain way? Why do people prefer to access services that way rather than this way? Why is this challenge a challenge for them? Then you want to go into more depth, and therefore you want to go for a smaller number, kind of maybe 12 to 15 people sometimes is enough to get to the level of depth that you need in order to reframe your thinking about the challenge. And practically, recruitment for me would be, I just try and think about who is it that I'm trying to reach, and then what kinds of people or organizations are in touch with them, and then just go through those people or organizations to reach out to them. Then when you're planning your research, you also want to think about framing your questions. So how do you know what you're going to ask? You know, what's your main question? What are you trying to find out? Again, I'm going to give you a simple framework to do this, but sometimes it can take quite a lot of time to actually define what the right question is. I will start with what I already know about the problem. So that can be based on existing research or data that I know for sure exists. I will kind of list everything that I know on the wall and everything that's for sure. And then I will list separately what my assumptions are about the problem or about the solution. And that's generally based on my experience or my intuition, or maybe a couple of chats that I've had with people, but it's not necessarily data. And then I will also map what I don't know at all. Like, you know, maybe, yeah, like I might, maybe within my assumptions, I can put something about what I think the solution is. But then when I start listing what I don't know, maybe what I don't know is how people would engage with that solution, or how they would react to that solution. So yeah, mapping what you know, what you assume, and what you don't know. And then generally the question that you want to ask tends to be between the last two bubbles. So between your assumptions and between what you don't know. When you're framing questions as well, it's really important to be aware of the biases that you're bringing to research. Everyone is coming to research with their own life experience, their own, like, who they are as a human being, their own kind of frame and the way they see the world. Even the most experienced researchers. So it's really important to be aware of the biases that you're bringing and the assumptions that you're bringing. Two of them that you really need to pay attention to are confirmation bias. So that's when you're only asking or hearing what you already know is true, or what you already believe to be true. For example, you might be, I don't know, doing some research about, maybe you have an idea around bringing people to nature and developing their confidence in the wilderness. And if you frame your question as, would you like to feel more confident in nature? The answer is likely to be yes, or maybe it's going to be indifferent, but it's very unlikely to be negative or to be any richer than that. If you frame your question quite openly as, what has been your experience of being in wilderness so far? Then what you'll get is a range of really rich, deep stories where people will maybe start talking about their challenges with being in nature, the kind of high points, the high points and the pain points, and they will, like, the data that you'll get is just going to be a lot richer, and then you're going to be able to use that data to shape what it is, that the intervention that you're trying to do, rather than just get a confirmation of what you already know is true. The second bias to be aware of is social desirability bias. So that's basically the idea that as human beings, we want to be liked and we don't want to show our failures. So if you're, for example, if you are doing kind of usability testing, or if you're asking people how they've experienced the service in the past, instead of asking them, what did you find difficult? Maybe try asking them a more open question, like, what would you do to improve this? And the reason why is that if you're asking just what did you find difficult, then people might want to downplay their difficulty because they don't want to appear to be, to have failed in front of you. But if you're asking them what would you do to improve this, then their answers might be more generative and more honest as well, because you're asking for their ideas and opinions. So just a few, I could do a whole talk on interview methods, but just two kind of takeaways when you're doing interviews. The first one is quite obvious, but it's easy to forget that when you're in a research situation, is to be really present and really listen to people. So not just focus on what is the next question that you're going to ask, or like how you're going to follow up that answer with another question. Like silence is generally okay. Sometimes silence helps people to actually go that little bit deeper and to kind of clarify to you what it is that they're trying to express, or to open up more. And then be attentive to discomfort and kind of micro emotions that people might not show overtly to you. So just kind of ask for confirmation of what you're reading into what they're saying. And then secondly, that's kind of a personal preference, but I like to use visual tools a lot during research. I find that they help the conversation to stay focused, and also they tend to work well with children and young people. So I'll give you an example of the last image here with the cards. That's a game that I developed when I was doing research with young carers. And I was kind of asking them about their experience of being like caring for a family member, and how what challenges they encountered, whether that was at home or in school or with health services. And we brought them into a group, and we tried to have a kind of focus group, and we found that it was actually quite hard for the young carers to open up in front of each other, obviously, because when you're at that age, like kind of between 16 and 20-ish, you kind of have a status to maintain. And so we designed this game, which was essentially like a role-playing game, where the young people would have to solve a challenge together, and everyone had a different role to play, and they had to offer a solution from the perspective of a GP, from the perspective of a youth worker, a social worker, a head teacher. So by kind of putting themselves into the shoes of someone who was supposed to support them, then they were able to open up much more about the kind of support that they wanted to see. And finally, so when you've done all these interviews, all these workshops, and you're kind of generally, you have like a lot of data and a lot of stories, and you kind of, there's always a moment where you're thinking, what does this even mean? Like, what am I going to do with this? Like, there's always a moment of despair. And so, yeah, I think the next talk is going to focus a lot more on that, on like how do you use insights from research, and actually use that to shape your ideas. But what I can share with you is this image of like the wall of post-its is usually what this looks like in practice. So generally the way we would run this is everyone in the team, all the researchers come together, share the stories that they've heard, pick out on post-its the things that feel new or feel interesting or feel challenging, put them on the wall. And then start clustering, so start forming groups around different themes. And then you'll find when you start theming things, you'll find that behind each theme, there's generally a core challenge or a core opportunity. And then you can use these little phrases like, how can we solve this challenge? Or what if, this was in place in order to solve this challenge? And these little phrases I find really useful to help me make sense of the research, and make sense of the research in a way that can inform a solution as well. Okay, so little pause again. So ask yourself, who can give you insight into how people experience the problem you're researching? How can you build a relationship of trust with them? How are you going to use these insights to shape your idea? So just a few questions to ask yourself as you're planning research. The last section is about ethics, because obviously when you're working with people, you need to make sure that they're safe and that you're safe. So the first ethical consideration is about consent and gift. So informed consent is more than a form. So when you start research, like at the very least, what you need to have is a piece of paper that says in writing what the research is for, and how people's data is going to be used. And then as well, a contact for people to get in touch with after they've done the research, if they have any kind of amendments to make, or if there is anything that, if they want to remove themselves from the research. And the reason why I say it's more than a form is because people don't read forms. So when you start research, you need to talk people through what it is that they're actually signing up for, and make sure that they understand that. So, and if they don't understand it because I don't know, they have whatever vulnerability that means that they can process that kind of information, or maybe they're under 16, then you need to get someone else on board, whether it's a carer or a guardian, to make sure that that information is understood. And consent is also something you practice during research. So it's asking, if you're taking pictures, for example, it's asking people whether they're okay with it as you're doing it, as well as in the form. It's kind of repeatedly asking if they're okay with you asking about, whatever topic you're asking about. So it's something you practice during the interview, as well as something you kind of get them to sign before you start. And then the second thing to consider is, and I think that's a question that's come up in the chat actually, it's around incentives. It is really important to pay participants for their time. I think a lot of research can be quite extractive, in the sense that you kind of just come in, take people's stories, do whatever you do with those stories, and then people either never hear about it again, or don't feel like they've gotten anything from contributing quite a lot of their, not just their time, but also opening up to you in quite a deep way. So I think it's really important to pay participants at the very least for their time. If you can't afford to pay them, then look for other ways of rewarding them. And yeah, like try for that reward to not just be tokenistic, but to actually be meaningful to them. So even if you need to ask them, what would make it worth it for you to participate in this research? That's really important, because as researchers, we have actually quite a lot of power. The second one is equity. So who do you never hear from, and why? So again, I come back to this idea of inclusion. What communities are you not reaching? Why are you not reaching them? And can you use the research to actually reach them, but in a meaningful way? So not just to get, a couple of stories or a couple of insights from this underrepresented group, but actually to make a commitment to at least not just listening to what they have to say, but actually include their voices and their ideas into what you're then developing. And I, like, over the years, I kind of keep coming back to this idea that people are not hard to reach, but organizations are. So if you feel like you're not reaching a group of people, it's because they don't see themselves in your organizations, or they don't see that what you have to offer is for them. And that can be for a bunch of reasons. It could be because of, the makeup of your staff that just doesn't represent them, or it could be because you're actually not speaking the language that they're used to speaking. And when I say language, I don't just mean, foreign language. I just mean like the words that you're using maybe don't resonate with them. So yeah, again, if you feel like there's a group of people that will really benefit from your services, but they're not engaging, then you need to ask yourself, what is it within your organization that makes them feel like they don't belong? And then finally, the question of well-being is really important. So when you go into research, your first responsibility is to the participant, it's not to the data. So yes, you want to capture stories and you want to capture insights and you want to get answers to your questions. But as a researcher, you first need to make sure that the participant is not going to be in any way harmed by what you're asking them, and is going to feel good kind of throughout the research process, or at least is going to have a way of processing what might have come up through the research. Sometimes what we ask of people, even if we don't intend for it to be particularly deep, can actually be quite can kind of revive some past traumas. And you're not always aware that you're doing that, or that it's happening when you're talking to a participant. So an example of how to deal with that, for example, is, well, first of all, continually asking them if they're okay to go there, but also once the interview is finished, you can ask them if they would want some further support, or if they might want to be linked to counseling, just to kind of process the content of the conversation. The second thing, obviously, is we're in the middle of a pandemic. So yeah, just be aware of that. Like, everyone is going through a lot of grief and a lot of stress at the moment. So that's something to consider when you're planning research. Yeah, that's kind of maybe obvious. And then remember that as a researcher, you also need care. So sometimes you might come out of an interview and actually, feel it quite deeply, and it will impact you, and it will impact not just your well-being, but also your capacity to engage with more people after that. So you kind of, for example, you don't want to have too many research sessions or too many interviews in the same day. You want to space them out so that you can kind of breathe in between. Is very important. Like, you need care too. Okay, so the final question is, how will you ensure that this is not just a useful experience for you, but also a positive experience for participants? Cool. I've seen that a few people have put questions in the chat. So do we have a little bit of time to answer them?
We're at time, Fan. So if you have 5 minutes to stay behind, perhaps you and I could have a bit of a conversation through those questions, and we can share the recording with people. I'm sure a lot of the participants will have to leave the call now because everyone's very busy. But I'm happy to stay for 5 minutes, and we can kind of have a quick chat through some of those questions.
Okay, cool.
So, thank you everyone for joining. Those of you that will need to leave us now on the hour, really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Just to let you know, we've got some really great workshops coming up in the next week, particularly with our with Shift's CEO Nick Stanhope. which are all about organizational design and organizational planning right now in this exact moment, and how do we plan our organizations in a time where everything is so changeable. Those sessions are workshops specifically for financial wellbeing and early years organizations, and they're really interactive, practical sessions that are going to take you through a lightweight framework to really think about prioritization and planning. So I super encourage you to participate and get stuck in with those. The financial wellbeing one is this week on the 12th of November, and the early years one is next week on the 19th. Thanks so much. Right, Fan, let's get stuck into some questions. So actually, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to pose a few of the ones that felt really relevant to right now that came through. So we heard from Anna about how there's a lot of families that are digitally excluded at the moment, and so it's really difficult to get services to them, let alone reach them for research. So I wondered if you have any ideas about how we might do remote research with digitally excluded kind of families or service users or participants.
Yeah, that's a very challenging one, and one that I don't have that much experience of. But one thing that I've done in the past is like send people a pack of tools. So it might be sending them like, one of those, what are they called? Like single-use cameras, and maybe sending them like a map or whatever, like a bunch of questions. Maybe some, and then some tasks and questions that you want them to answer and complete, and then just get them to mail it back to you. And you can have the mailing back prepaid, so that, it's not a barrier to them. So that's a way of doing it, just good old post. And also the phone, is not my favorite means of talking to people because you cannot see them. But sometimes the fact that you cannot see people can actually be quite freeing for them to just talk to you and kind of open up without feeling like they're being judged. So yeah, just good old ways of
so in a way going a little bit old school.
Yeah, exactly.
And what about any tips for kind of doing co-design online now? So kind of there was a question in the chat earlier about how co-design can be a bit difficult to make fun and interesting online. So did you have any tips around
that? Yeah, I would say like try and prep people in advance as much as possible. So you might give them a challenge to do on their own before they kind of come together and share. So they would have kind of worked through the challenge themselves, and then they will kind of come to the session prepared to share their kind of creative ideas. I think that's a good way of I think with online meetings or workshops, there's often a lot of time kind of spent in trying to understand what's in each other's minds. So if everyone has had time to get into the challenge, then the session will run smoother.
Thank you. Farah's asked a few questions in the Q&A function.
Yeah.
The first one of those was about incentivizing peer research specifically. So do you pay people to take that role as peer researchers? And then and this is something that seems to be kind of resonating with a lot of the organizations here, particularly if you have limited budgets, what can you do there?
My take is always pay people. I know it's not always possible. And I know that, some people will, they might, for example, you could look at doing volunteering opportunities, or you could look at, kind of almost seeing that as training for people who might be interested in these kinds of careers. But my take is always pay people if you can. And if you can't, maybe review your plans or review your budget so that you can pay people.
And I guess that kind of really links into something that Eliza put in the chat, where she amened to your quote, which anyone who's not included in your research is excluded from it. But asked about how you know where to draw the line when you're trying to stay within a brief, a budget, and a time scale allowed to a project, and how you know when to push the boundaries for that conclusion.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I guess, we're always, when we plan a project, it's always a balance of what will be the ideal thing to do, and then what is feasible within our time constraints. And again, what I would say is, like, if you have to choose between a group of people that you find harder to get to, or maybe you haven't engaged with them before, and that will take more resources from you, and a group of people that actually you can reach really quickly, and you can get your insights kind of tomorrow, but it might not be really, you might not hear anything new from them, then prioritize the excluded group, or the underrepresented group. So if you have to kind of juggle your budget in order to reach them, then do that.
And something that Farah asked, which I'm going to try and summarize, I guess, which resonates, kind of follows on from that in a way, is what about if you don't know what you don't know? So if you're designing a service that impacts a particular group, a particular audience that you don't have access to, what do you do then? How do you plan your research for that kind of unknown?
Yeah, so that's when speaking to experts is really important. So, like, if you don't personally have access to this group of people, someone else will. Try to find that someone else. It might be someone from another organization. It might be a piece of research online. It might be, like, I don't know, maybe even just a Facebook group that has this group of people subscribe to it. Try to think creatively about how you can reach that group of people. And on the point of making assumptions, it's okay to start research with assumptions, as long as you are clear with yourself that there are assumptions as you go into it. And as long as you're ready for these assumptions to be challenged afterwards.
So I think one of the things that was included in Farah's question was about kind of realizing later on in the design process that your service would work for another audience or be important for another audience. And so I think it's interesting thinking about how you build that into the planning or the planning of the research methods when you suddenly have a whole new audience that you have to start thinking about.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I guess you kind of have a few decision points in like the whole design thinking process. So you have a decision point at the very beginning where you're deciding on what the challenge is. Then you have a decision point when you're planning the research, and then you have again a decision point when you're kind of synthesizing your research and then deciding on which challenge you're going to focus on and which ideas you're going to focus on. So you don't have to cover everything from the start. So you might start your research with like a smaller group of people, and then through it you realize, oh, actually this group would really benefit from my service. And then maybe that's you start a new research phase, or like a mini research phase to cover that group. That you kind of have to be quite flexible with the design process, even though it looks like those two diamonds. In reality, it's not like that, and you're always having to kind of question the decisions you've made early on in the process. And that's like I know it's very challenging, especially when I worked in the public sector, because we are used to seeing the start of a project and the end of a project, but we kind of, especially now when things are moving so fast, we kind of have to be able to go back to research and back to ideas, and kind of do that a little bit through the process as you go. So yeah, it's messy, but so is life.
Kind of seeing it like a messy cycle. I'm really aware that we've reached 10 past and I don't want to keep you any longer. There was one last question. Do you have time to squeeze it in?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, great. So that question was about having a solution, for example, at the start of a project. So rather than researching for the solution, having the idea already. So the example here was encouraging people to home bake using wholemeal flour rather than white flour. Is it okay to then research in a really focused way on, for example, the barriers, or should that research be broadened out and not start with that solution?
Yeah, it's a good example. And I would say it depends on what your idea is based on. So if your idea is already based on really good research and you're very confident on why you're doing what you're doing, then yeah, maybe the like user research that you're doing should be more focused on the solution, on barriers to barriers for people to actually make it happen in their lives. But if it's an idea that's just come from your head or maybe it can come from your own experience, but you haven't talked to anybody else about it, or you haven't, you don't have any evidence from any other sources that this is the right thing to do, then I would say you need to broaden your research out, because whole meal flour versus white flour is a very narrow, it's quite a narrow problem. And so within the scope of people's lives, you might find that it's a very, very tiny priority. So that's, yeah. I hope that's helpful.
I think that was super helpful. A huge thank you. I think you just fielded some really tough questions that me and the audience threw at you. So appreciate you fielding those with the expertise that you always bring and the care that you always bring. A few really lovely comments in the chat saying that things have really resonated with them and they've really enjoyed the session. So a huge thank you, and
great.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Thanks, Amelia. Bye, everyone. Thank you.